Hi, my name is Bryant Baker. I am the Director of Conservation and Research at Los Padres Forest Watch. Thank you for attending this webinar, and thanks to everyone who is watching at a later date on our website or on our YouTube channel. I am here today to talk again about a massive project that is being proposed in the Los Padres National Forest called the Ecological Restoration Project. I'm going to talk a little bit about our concerns as Los Padres Forest Watch and some concerns that we've heard from other organizations and scientists and indigenous groups and people just around the area. But today I'm going to really focus on Santa Barbara County. So if you're interested in more specifics about Ventura and Kern County, how the project would affect those areas. We've already done a webinar on that. That should be available on our website soon if it isn't already. And then after this webinar, we will do another one in a couple of days that is going to be focused on San Luis Obispo and Kern counties. So with that said, I'm going to get started. Again, for those of you just arriving, you should be able to ask questions through the Q&A function. That is the best place to submit questions to me. You can ask questions at any time. I'll keep an eye on it and try to answer questions as I go. You can also chat. You can type stuff into the chat box. You can make it so that everyone can see your messages, or you can make it so that only I can see your message. But the chat function is there for you to use however, and preferably it's to let me know if something is not working, we have a technical issue or something. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. We'll also do a Q&A at the end. Okay. All right. Again, we're going to be focusing on Santa Barbara County as it relates to the latest proposal from the Forest Service in the Los Padres National Forest. This is actually an area included in the project area. That's the San Rafael Wilderness in the background, and but this area in the foreground is all included within the project area, and I'll talk about that here in a bit. So for those of you who are unfamiliar or just this is the first time that you're really encountering this particular issue, we have done a more broad webinar that is available on our YouTube channel and on our website. We did that weeks ago, and it really goes into some of the basics about this project. But just as a refresher, it is called the Ecological Restoration Project. I'll talk a little bit here, over the course of this presentation about why we maybe disagree with that name. But in general, it is about 235,000 acres, and it stretches from basically from like Fraser Mountain in the Fraser Park area all the way up to the Big Sur area, so the Monterey Ranger District. The only area in the Los Padres National Forest that is just entirely excluded from this project is the Ojai Ranger District. And that has to do with the fact that this project analysis, the environmental review process that the Forest Service is conducting right now, is actually being funded by the utility company PG&E. They gave them a $1.7 million grant to do this environmental analysis. And because PG&E doesn't have any coverage in southern Ventura County, the Ojai Ranger District was excluded. Whether a project of similar scope is proposed in the Ojai Ranger District at a later date is unclear. So of the 235,000 acres total that this project would affect, there are basically two project area types, and those are forest health treatment units, which are about 48,000 acres total, and then fuel break and defense zones, which are 186,000 acres. Now, and I'll explain what these are in a moment. So this is the project map. So you can see the entire Los Padres here. This is the southern Los Padres, and then this is the Monterey Ranger District. If maybe some of you weren't aware, but a lot of the Big Sur area, most of the Big Sur region, is actually within the Los Padres National Forest in the Monterey Ranger District, and there is quite a bit of the project area in this district. You can also see there have been some recently proposed and approved projects that have similar activities, logging and chaparral clearing, that we've been, in some cases fighting, trying to steer the Forest Service in the right direction in terms of, minimizing ecological damage and focusing on activities that would actually uh, improve wildfire safety in communities. But some of those you may be familiar with: the Mount Pinos Project, the Cuddy Valley Project, Tukuya Ridge, the Pine Mountain Project, as well as a fuel break project that was approved a few years ago up in the Monterey Ranger District. So again, today I'm going to just focus on this portion of the project area. So the Santa Barbara County area. This includes part of the Santa Barbara Ranger District, which would be mostly in the southern part of the county, but also the San Luis Obispo, or the Santa Lucia Ranger District up in the northern part of Santa Barbara County. And if you look closely, hopefully you can see this map and it all makes sense. But these yellow areas, those are what are called fuel break and defense zones. And then the browner areas, those are the forest health treatment units. They have stayed out of the designated wilderness areas entirely, which is great. But there is a lot of overlap with the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act land designations that would go into effect if the Senate passes one of a couple of bills that includes the legislation that the House has passed. And that would actually designate a lot of new wilderness. This whole area up here would become, some of it would become designated potential wilderness. A lot of it would become wilderness additions to existing wilderness areas like San Rafael Wilderness and Dick Smith. And then there are also like some national scenic areas that would be proposed in a couple of places like down here in the Santa Barbara front country. So just as a snapshot of some of the places that could be affected, these are places that you might be familiar with if you've spent much time in the Los Padres National Forest in Santa Barbara County. This is sort of from that from that area that I showed in that very first slide, in the intro slide. This is closer to Ranger Peak, which is over by Figueroa Mountain, but that's part of the eastern part of the Hurricane Deck out there in the distance, if you're familiar with that area. This is Davy Brown Trail here. This is also close to Figueroa Mountain. I focus a lot on the Figueroa Mountain area because it would be pretty heavily impacted by this project. This is Figueroa Mountain itself, or at least part of the mountain. There's some really pretty silverbush lupin growing here and some poppies. This is Grass Mountain. You might have hiked up Grass Mountain. A lot of that is actually included in the project area. And then this is Red Rock. So if you've been to the Red Rock area down Paradise Road, much of this actually is included. A lot of the San Ynez River, the riparian area along the river, is included within the project area. So when we talk about Santa Barbara County, we're going to focus on just a few ecosystems because they're the predominant ecosystems in this county and are the predominant ecosystems that would be affected by this project. So the main one is chaparral. Hopefully you are all familiar with it, with this ecosystem. It is our most dominant ecosystem in our region. It is the most widely distributed ecosystem in the state. It's pretty amazing shrubland ecosystem. Manzanitas are often a big component of it, as you see here. If you look at like the San Ynez Mountains, if you're in the Santa Barbara area and you look into the front country, most of what you're seeing is this evergreen shrubland ecosystem that we call chaparral. Its sibling is coastal sage scrub, which is not quite as evergreen. It has some shrubs that are sort of deciduous. They will lose their leaves, or their leaves will kind of shrivel up and become very brown in the late summer and fall during the driest part of the year. We call that drought deciduous. It's also tends to be a lot shorter, a lot softer. Sometimes people will call it soft chaparral. This is my partner Gabby walking through a bunch of I think this is purple sage. This is some cool coastal sage scrub. I think this might be in the Ventura backcountry, but you tend to see it in drier areas. It's not quite as dense as chaparral typically, and again, it's not very tall comparatively. And then the other big ecosystem, which actually it can be a few different types, is oak woodland. So the one one type you see here is coast live oak woodland. That's what these dominant trees are, coast live oaks. This is on the north side of the San Ynez Mountains, so it's kind of lush back here because there's more moisture availability on these north-facing slopes. But we also have blue oak woodlands. We have valley oak woodlands. Those are a little bit different. They are those two trees are not quite evergreen. They are also drought deciduous, and it's it can look different depending on which oak woodland you're looking at. So again, all of this sort of makes sense when you actually look at a map of the vegetation types and the distribution across the county within the Los Padres National Forest. So these light green areas, that is shrubland. That's going to be mostly chaparral with some coastal sage scrub peppered throughout. And you can see that that really is the dominant ecosystem in this area. We do have some areas that are kind of grassy, grass dominated. A lot of those are, historically have been heavily grazed. They've been type converted. They might have been chaparral or coastal sage scrub previously. And some of these, like there are some potreros up here in the Sierra Madre Mountains that have probably been grasslands for many thousands of years because of the soil type there. And then if you look, this makes sense when you're looking at a map where you can really see the mountains. But a lot of our oak woodlands, they're on the north facing slopes of these kind of east-west running mountain ranges. And then you'll also see that they are kind of common in riparian areas. So these little canyons, especially, that's where you'll often find oaks. There is some true conifer forest, a little bit up on Figueroa Mountain, definitely some on Big Pine Mountain, that area, but it is not very common in the Santa Barbara County area. And then if you go pretty far north, like up to the Cuyama Valley area, you'll start getting into some pinyon juniper woodland, which is really common just to the east in northern Ventura County and southern Kern County. But I'm not going to talk so much about that because it's just not a huge portion of this particular area. So now you're looking at the exact same data, but it's just showing what is in the project area. So that can give you a better idea of what the project would impact. And again, it's mostly shrubland. So even areas that are labeled as forest health treatment units, like this one, where you see these big area, like contiguous areas, those are mostly these forest health treatment units. A lot of it is just not even truly forested. And this, is just always confusing for people because it's called the Los Padres National Forest. I mean, this presentation, I called it forest on the chopping block. But again, most of what we're dealing with is shrubs. So in terms of what, how Santa Barbara County would be affected, it is the largest proportion of the project area. So of those 235,000 acres included in the project, almost 94,000 acres or so is in Santa Barbara County alone. So it would, this county is getting, is going to be pretty impacted in the Los Padres National Forest by this project. So let's get into what these two different treatment types are. So the first one, again, forest health treatment units. This is 48,000 acres across the entire project area. And let me just go back and look. I'm curious. So it's about almost 26,000 acres of forest health treatment units in Santa Barbara County. So by far the most forest health treatment unit area is in Santa Barbara County, interestingly, despite the fact that I would say there's the least amount of true forest in this county, in the Los Padres National Forest. So what these areas would allow, the activities that would be allowed would be mechanical removal of live and dead trees up to 24 inches in diameter. Whether there will be some exceptions allowed to that, larger trees may be removed, that's not very clear. We only have an initial 17-page document from the Forest Service that's telling us what they're planning to do, but we'll learn more as this this process unfolds. But for now, this is all we know. And what they're saying specifically that they would allow is, again, mechanically and or hand cutting, mowing, masticating. You'll see some masticators here in a moment, chipping and pile burning. The Forest Service has been saying that this project is all about prescribed fire. I would put a really large asterisk on that, because what I'm seeing in the project description that they've put out there is very heavily focused on mechanical removal of vegetation rather than prescribed fire. So to give you a sense of what this might look like, and if you've seen the past two webinars about this project, some of this stuff will look familiar to you. But here's an area. Now this is mostly ponderosa pine forest, so this is going to be a forest type that you won't see as much in Santa Barbara County, but you would see it over in like the Mount Pinos region, or Alamo Mountain, Fraser Mountain, those areas in northern Ventura County and southern Kern County. But this is up in the Plumas National Forest, and I just think it's a pretty good example. And it's one of the few examples where I have these satellite images that show the action in progress. This is the Cradle Valley Forest Health Project. This is before the project was implemented, and so the Forest Service was saying that this forest was way too dense and it needed to have canopy reductions, and they needed to remove a bunch of trees, and they did so through a process called commercial thinning. And this is what it looked like during the project. So you can see these are all skid trails. These are where they had heavy equipment moving across the landscape, going and cutting trees. Feller bunchers would go and cut trees, and different types of equipment might be moving logs from where they're cut over to, or entire trees over to these landing areas. That's where logs are usually piled up. That's where these tree canopies are cut and removed. And I believe a lot of this was actually perhaps going to a biomass facility so a lot of this was going to be burned for electricity production. But you can see there's some pretty serious impacts when you start introducing heavy equipment into the equation in these forest projects. So there's a lot of ground disturbance and just a lot of removal of understory vegetation, and a lot of removal of overstory trees in this case, especially. So, in the Los Padres National Forest, we haven't really seen any commercial thinning projects actually be implemented yet. So we, as Forest Watch, we've been fighting some projects that have this sort of commercial component to it. The Forest Service likes to say, oh, these are not commercial logging projects. And I think what they're trying to say is, well, they're not, we're not proposing to go out and clear cut places. And I think like we understand that that the Forest Service is not proposing to go and clear cut the forest. That's not our concern. Our concern is that they're going to do some pretty intensive thinning, overstory canopy removal, and that will involve some large tree cutting and removal. And so anytime you start dealing with a certain size of tree, I mean, generally once you get over 10, 12 inches in diameter, those are what we call commercially sized trees. They can be sold to timber mills. They can be, turned into wood products. A lot of this material can be burned for biomass. So that can be a commercial process in and of itself. But just because it's not clear cutting doesn't mean it's not a commercial endeavor, especially if there is a private entity that is being contracted to do the work, or, a lot of this, these products, a lot of these wood, the logs can be sold to mills. So there can definitely be commercial aspects to all of this. And that's where we usually get very concerned, especially when there's going to be a lot of heavy equipment usage. Now, this is from Figueroa Mountain, from a project that was approved back in 08, I want to say. And this was a non-commercial project. There was a diameter limit, and they weren't going to be selling any of the material here. And I don't think there was any heavy equipment component to it either. So this was all hand cutting. They definitely cut some dead trees, some snags, and I'm happy to go into, I could talk for hours about the importance of dead trees ecologically, but I'm not going to really focus on that this webinar. But you can see, even with these non-commercial projects, it can be pretty intensive, and it can you can really see it, and it can have some impacts on the landscape for sure. This is another non-commercial thinning project that was up on Cerro Noroeste. That is a mountain up by Mount Pinos. For those of you unfamiliar, that's in southern Kern County. And again, they were removing mostly smaller trees. I don't remember the exact diameter limit here in this particular area, but you can see a lot of those trees that have been cut and left, a lot of slash material here as well. And this was there for months. I mean, I don't know what the status, I think I took this back in 2020, maybe last year. I can't remember. But this slash material was there like all summer, as far as I know, on the ground, which of course can be problematic from a fire risk standpoint. But usually what happens with these non-commercial projects is a lot of this material is piled up, and then they'll do these pile burns, sometimes during like the winter or the spring. Here's another area, and I think this is the last one that I'm going to talk about, the sort of forest, thinning stuff. But this is a really intensive commercial thinning project up in Northern California. And again, I think people have this concept, like when they hear the word thinning, that uh, it's just removing small trees and saplings. Maybe it involves pruning, but a lot of these projects will have this commercial component to it that incentivizes removing larger trees. Some projects just straight up have really intense canopy reduction targets, regardless of whether it's for commercial purposes or not. They just are proposing to remove a lot of trees in a given area, and a lot of mature trees. So you can see there's some pretty serious impacts here. Of course, there's the large tree removal, but also you can see a lot of understory disturbance, where there's very little understory vegetation period here. And of course, that can be a major issue for a lot of different wildlife species and plant species. So I'm going to focus more, though, on the fuel break and defense zones, because I think that is a major part of this project. Especially considering that it is the majority of the area, is 186,000 acres, and it would really impact a few different ecosystems specifically that I'm going to go into detail about. But just so you know, in these fuel break and defense zones, if there are trees of any diameter can be removed in these areas. So there is no diameter limit. That 24-inch limit doesn't exist for these, at least as of right now. And these areas would allow several different activities, including heavy equipment use, mechanical or hand thinning of trees and shrubs, mechanical mastication, which I'm going to talk about a lot here in just a bit, chipping of smaller trees and shrubs, targeted grazing, all sorts of things can happen in these fuel break and defense zones. So the main concern here is mastication. This is the primary way that fuel breaks in chaparral and shrubland areas are created. This is what we've seen in the Los Padres National Forest for many years when they've worked on fuel breaks. In fact, this is a photo of the Camino Cielo fuel break. I don't remember exactly where this was, but it's in the Los Padres National Forest in the San Ynez Mountains. This is a photo by our executive director, Jeff Kuiper. So this is what a masticator looks like in action. You can see it's got this big gnarly piece of equipment here at the end of this arm that basically just grinds shrubs and small trees just down into mulch. And so that's what you're seeing here is a bunch of native vegetation that has been ground up into this sort of mulchy material. There's also, of course, these soil disturbance issues because of the heavy equipment. But there's just a lot of impacts here going on. This is the same, I think this was part of the same project. So this is a masticator. I just wanted to give you a sense of like what mature, healthy chaparral looks like compared to what these fuel breaks look like. And so, it's not being created with a bulldozer, which I guess is good. We see bulldozers used, especially during fire suppression activities. And they look very, very similar though. So it's not like it's a lot better, but it is, I guess, a little bit less problematic than bulldozers, but the impacts are still fairly major. And it's a lot of loss of, mature native shrubs. A lot of these shrubs, like these here, these are manzanitas. In fact, these are big berry manzanitas specifically. So these are what we call obligate cedars. You will only see those come like they'll only repopulate areas from seed that has been stimulated by fire specifically. So a lot of times in these fuel breaks, what we'll see is that these kind of species, that it's usually certain types of manzanitas and ceanothus shrubs, that they won't come back in these fuel breaks because there is nothing to stimulate their seed germination, because this is again all mechanical rather than fire. Here's another angle of this fuel break, and so they left a couple of shrubs. I don't know. I don't know what the purpose of that was. I guess it's nice, but it's completely fundamentally altered the ecosystem here. And again, just not there's nothing going on here except for mulch and bare earth. So these again are very intensive operations. Here's another view. They can be quite something to look at. I'll say that. The other way that fuel breaks are often created in chaparral are through hand cutting. So this is one in the Cleveland National Forest that I visited at the beginning of this year. So right after it was created, you can see lots of shrubs were cut and then piled, and those will eventually probably be piled. They'll be burned in these piles, would be my guess. But this is a pretty big swath of land that has been heavily impacted by these activities. Here's another closer up view, and maybe gives you a little bit of a sense of scale. This is like a fence. These are these piles. There are a lot of them. They're pretty big. Each one of these piles would be like a small bonfire, I'd say. And a lot of what's coming back in this heavily disturbed area is non-native grasses, particularly in this area. It was wild oats, I believe. And then again, that's the mature chaparral with a lot of ceanothus actually blooming. That's what you're seeing, those white flowers, and a lot of chamise as well. So that's what the entire area would have looked like before it was turned into a fuel break. Over time, because fuel breaks are usually maintained over and over, every at least once or so a decade, with that repeated disturbance, especially with heavy equipment, what we tend to see is a conversion of these areas to non-native grasses and weeds. So that's what we have here in the Camino Cielo fuel break along West Camino Cielo. So I'm looking out. This is like the San Ynez Peak and Broadcast Peak area in the San Ynez Mountains. So I'm looking west here. Lizard's Mouth would be behind me. The Gun Club would be behind me. And so you can see this is in a time of year where it's really obvious that it is mostly non-native grasses, particularly wild oats. That's what you see here in the foreground, kind of out of focus. A lot of black mustard as well. And so this is, of course, a major issue, especially when these fuel breaks are along roads, because we tend to see human-caused ignitions, which are the predominant ignition source in our region because of the very small amount of lightning that we get each year, and especially lightning that occurs at a time of year where it's not immediately, a lot of rain happens right after and puts out the ignition. So human caused ignitions dominate the landscape, and they tend to be relatively close to roads, and they tend to start in non-native grasses and weeds because they are so what we call flashy. They're very flammable. These are annuals. They dry out very early in the year. They have a high surface area to volume ratio, which makes them extremely flammable. Think of this as like, this is your tinder that you would use to start a fire. So if you want to start a campfire, going and grabbing a bunch of dried grass would be a really easy way to get a fire started. And then you would want to have some other stuff on top, of course. But yeah, we see fires often start in these areas, and then they move into these native shrublands. And it's hard to tell, but what you're actually looking at is the Whittier fire area a couple of years after it burned. So if anyone remembers that fire, that was in 2017. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. But this fuel break completely bisects that fire. That fire started on the north slope, and then it moved over this fuel break. And so all of what you see over there is burned. All of what you see over there is burned. This is burned. So you can see like the native shrubs coming back, resprouting, coming up from seed. But the fuel break, even in the areas where it burned, is already, again, it's just the non-native grasses have remained dominant there. There's this sort of question of like, well, what do these landscapes look like historically? And with chaparral, it's really difficult to go very far back in time. We don't have things like tree rings in chaparral. It's difficult to say the least, and it'll make more sense here in a moment when I explain the fire regime here. Um, but we often will hear about, what did these areas look like in the early 1900s? We've seen the Forest Service use data from the 1930s from a project called the Vegetation Type Mapping Project back then, and that they'll sort of make these comparisons to historical, what will say are historical reference conditions. Whether or not those are really reference conditions, a baseline is an entirely different matter. But I do just want to show some images from the 30s of a lot of these areas that are dominated by chaparral. I think all of these are from Santa Barbara County. Here's an area where you've got a lot of coulter pines that have come up. These are a really cool species of conifer. They're semi-serotinous. That means their cones often won't fully open, or they won't open at all until they've been heated up by fire. You see them often growing right alongside shrubs in chaparral areas. They can be quite dense, and they'll grow until a fire comes. They often will burn at high severity, and then they release all their seeds and then come up from seed. It's a cool process, but you can see really dense shrubs, dense conifers here, young conifers. Here's another area. I forget exactly where this is, but these are some. This is chaparral. This is dense, mature chaparral. Here's an area that had burned, I don't know how many years before. You can still see some of a lot of this is oak here, and so you can still see some of the dead parts of the above ground biomass, but most of those have resprouted. Here's some mature chaparral in the San Ynez Mountains. I think this is up by San Marcos Pass. This is a really big manzanita. My point is, when we go back as far back as we have photos, we can see that a lot of these areas, especially like in the San Ynez Mountains, they were dense shrublands historically, just as they are today, and that's not abnormal. Now, the fire regime, this is where things can get a little bit complicated, but it's really important to understand this. And I'm not going to spend too terribly much time on this, but the natural fire regime, at least the fire regime that has been dominant on the landscape for the last several thousand years, is usually described as large, intense, but infrequent fire. So usually a given area, you can expect that that area would burn at least once every 30 to 150 or more years. And when it does burn, it tends to be in the form of a crown fire where, in the form of a crown fire where most of that above ground biomass burns. And when we see most of the acreage burned is during the late summer and fall, when you have extreme wind conditions like sundowner winds in the summer and Santa Ana winds in the fall. So it is typical, this is normal to see this scene after a fire in chaparral. This was after the cave fire near Santa Barbara. This was 1 week after the fire that I was up there. And this is an area I've spent a lot of time in, and it can be really jarring. Like it can look like it's been completely destroyed, and I understand why people get freaked out when they see this. But you have to understand, again, this is the norm, and it's going to make sense here in a moment. So, how do we know this? Well, we know, at least in terms of the fact that we've had large wildfires occurring for hundreds of years from charcoal deposits in the Santa Barbara Basin. This is a cool study from 1999 where they took these sediment cores from the Santa Barbara Basin and they looked at layers of charcoal, and they were able to correlate when they were seeing a certain amount of charcoal, certain sizes of charcoal. They were able to correlate that with known fire activity over the last 100 years, and then they kind of established this correlation, and then they can go back further in time where we don't have fire data. Nobody was keeping record of fire activity, but they can show that like every place where you see an arrow pointing, that is a fire that was at least 50,000 acres in size, and this is just in mainly the Santa Barbara County area. So these are fires that could that were typically burning under Santa Ana wind conditions, and then that charcoal was either getting it can get moved into the Santa Barbara Basin in two different ways. The primary way would be smoke. You have these winds blowing out smoke over the ocean, and then that can deposit, and then those eventually make their way into the sediment. And another way, of course, would be through streams. Streams moving these charcoal particles into the basin. That's a more delayed process, and it's a little bit complicated. But yeah, we know that on average, somewhere in this region, a large fire has occurred once every 20 years or so. Not the same spot. Again, these areas, they typically, as a given area will burn once every 30 to 150 years. But within the entire region, large, 50,000 acre plus fires are not uncommon, and they haven't been, they've been common since for the last half millennium. So just to give you a sense of what happens naturally after a fire is a really beautiful process. Especially the older the chaparral is when it burns, the better it tends to recover, especially in areas that have good moisture availability. But this is going back to the cave fire. So this was the 1 week after the fire. A lot of this is like toyon. There's several different shrub species here. But one of the first things you see are these fire followers that come up in that first spring, and they usually will come up for a couple of springs after the fire. But like this is giant flowered Phacelia, which is a species you simply just don't see except in really recently burned areas. It's a really cool native wildflower, very important for a bunch of different native pollinators. And if we think about, again, this landscape, it just looks like it's been destroyed after fire, this chaparral landscape. But if you give it a little bit of time, not a whole lot of time really, you will see it return. That chaparral will return if you give it time. Now, there's a caveat to this, which I'll talk about in a minute, but this is the same scene. So what you're seeing is like, imagine, I don't know how to explain this. Hopefully it makes sense. And that's the idea is that it makes sense based on how I did it here. But I have this photo that I took of this particular area. I took it 1 month after the fire and then 16 months after the fire. And then I'm showing you on one half of the photo what it looks like in that 16 month post-fire period versus the 1 month post-fire. So you can see there's this amazing difference. And that's because a lot of these shrubs are actually able to resprout. So a lot of this growth, what you're seeing are these shrubs all look completely dead, but their underground parts, their roots and their burls, those survived the fire, and then they were able to resprout. You would be hard pressed to find one of these that was a resprouting shrub, like it has the capability to resprout, that was actually truly killed in this area. And then there's a lot of stuff coming up from seed in the areas between. And what you don't see is a lot of non-native grasses here. So this was old growth chaparral that burned. So again, the older that it is when it does burn, the better, because it has a bigger seed bank that it can, that will be stimulated. And these shrubs that are able to resprout, they have been able to store a bunch of carbohydrates in their burls and their root systems that they can then use to resprout really quickly. So this is what we like to see. This is what I would say looks really good. Here's that first image I showed you of the cave fire, and again, it looks really really bad. I would say to, a lot of people that would be their first impression. But here is that same image, but you're seeing a different slice of that image at different times after the fire. And so here's 1 month, 3 months. You can see a lot of cool plants starting to come up, like wild cucumber. That's what a lot of this on the ground is. Then you've got a bunch of fire followers in that first spring after the fire. This fire burned in November of 2019. So 6 months, you're talking about springtime in 2020. So that's a lot of the Phacelias and morning glory, all sorts of cool stuff. In the fall, that first fall, it can look really dead, but that's just a lot of these plants have become dormant for the dry season. And then later on, you'll see a lot of the shrubs are starting to fill in, the ones that are coming up from seed, and a lot of these other shrubs have been able to resprout. So this is the process that is supposed to play out. What we see unfortunately, is in areas that have been disturbed heavily, especially that have been purposefully type converted as like fuel breaks, for example. We don't see that process play out. We tend to see this feedback loop where once you get these non-native grasses and weeds established, it's very hard for it to return to that native chaparral form. And so here's that same area. This is where a lot of those photos I was showing you just now, that's where I took them. So this was all mature old growth chaparral that burned, and you can see it's doing really well after the fire. And then this is the Camino Cielo fuel break right next to it, which is actually where the fire started. It started in the fuel break and then moved into the chaparral here. But you can see by this point, it has regrown. All of this burned. So this was all blackened right after the fire, but it has already redeveloped all of that cover in terms of the non-native grasses, mostly wild oats and mustard there. So this is a major issue, and it's one of our big concerns about this project, because we would see more of these strips of land being converted to these non-native grasses and weeds out on the landscape. The other issue is when you have areas that are burning too frequently, that can cause problems. This is a good example of it, although it's a very small example, but everything you see here burned back in either 2008 or 2009, either in the T fire or the Hezecita fire. This is over by West Fork Cold Spring Trail. And then what you see here in the foreground is that same area, part of it reburned in the Thomas fire. So that was only less than 10 years later. And so all of these dead stems, those were all big pod ceanothus for the most part, which is an obligate seeding shrub. It's a shrub that can't resprout. It only comes up from seed after fire specifically. And what we're seeing here is that these individuals did not have time to grow to maturity between those two fires. And so there's a real lack of seedlings from this species in this area. You can see there's basically nothing growing here, but it should be really dense with seedlings at this point. This is 3 years after the Thomas fire, but even 3 years after the fire, we still have a lot of bare earth, which is not really what we want to see here. But over here, this is all those big pod ceanothus stems that they came up after the 2008 or 2009 fire, and they're still doing really well. But again, they haven't quite gotten to maturity so that they can start producing seed and then put that back into the soil and build that seed bank up before the next fire. Again, we see this problem of invasive plants in disturbed areas, especially. So along roads and in fuel breaks, that is a really common place to find non-native grasses and weeds. Here, this is I think Sunset Valley Road, or I forget what the road would be called at this spot, but this is kind of going off back toward Davy Brown Campground or Naira. And you can see it's a lot of mustard here. That's a lot of this taller stuff, and yellow star thistle. These are non-native weeds here. This is not what we want to see, but they're very common along this road. And then you've got some native kind of chaparral / coastal sage scrub going on down here. And so again, ignitions are likely to start in these grasses and weeds and then move into these native vegetation areas. You know, I don't know that I need to talk about this much, but I think the Alisol fire from last year in the San Ynez Mountains was pretty interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it started up along the ridgeline here in an area that would be part of the project area that would become a fuel break. So it actually started in what would have been a fuel break if this project were to be implemented. And then it was driven by sundowner winds really quickly, like within a matter of hours, it was down into this area over down by the coast. And so this is one of those examples where, you know, the fuel break wouldn't have done much to limit fire spread. The main spread was in this direction, as it usually is with sundowner winds. And it actually also spread into relatively young chaparral. So a lot of the chaparral, especially over here, this is where the Sherpa fire had burned back in 2016. A lot of that reburned, and that's way too short of an interval between fires for chaparral. But there's this idea that, oh, well, you know, if it's younger vegetation, younger chaparral, it will inhibit fire spread. Or maybe if it's grassland, you know, it's lower fuel loads, you know, that you would see in grasslands, that'll inhibit fire spread. But a lot of what burned in the Alisol fire was grazed grasslands with a lot of mustard and a lot of non-native grasses, and a lot of young chaparral. And when you look at what was old growth chaparral, it was only about 36% of what burned. This is in contrast to what you would see in like the media reports about this fire when it was burning. It was a lot of people saying, "Oh, it's burning in areas that haven't burned in 80 years or however many years." Um, and that's frustrating because that misses some important context here. So now moving to oak woodlands, how they deal with fire. They burn usually at sort of a mixed severity, in a mixed severity form. It'll often be low or moderate severity where you don't have a lot of overstory tree scorching, but sometimes you'll get these like higher severity areas where you do see right after the fire, a lot of the trees just look completely dead. But the cool thing about oaks, especially coast live oaks, is that they can do something called epicormic sprouting. So they can resprout from their trunks and their branches, and you'll often see canopy redevelopment in these areas within just a few years. So this is about 2 years between these photos, and you can see it's a pretty magical difference. Here's another area in the cave fire. This is a big coast live oak that I thought might actually have been killed in the fire when I first went out there. But within several months, it was really redeveloping its canopy. So a lot of times, again, the trees will look dead, but they're still quite alive and can thrive after these fires. Here's an area that is true coast live oak woodland this is actually in Ventura County, but this is before the Thomas fire. So you can really see this canopy cover here. This is all this sort of dark green. That's mostly oaks. There's definitely some sycamores and some other plants in there, but a lot of it is oak woodland. And this is what it looked like. We're looking at a satellite image, by the way. This is what it looked like after the fire, right after the fire. So this was in early 2018. And you would think everything is just completely dead, like, oh, this oak woodland is toast, it's gone, it's never going to come back. But the woodland is still there, and it's still doing pretty well, actually. Most of these oaks, the mature oaks, survived and were able to resprout from their branches and from their trunks. And so that canopy is really on its way to redeveloping, and given enough time, it will look just like this, ideally. Away from oak woodlands, you'll see other hardwoods. A lot of our native hardwoods in this region are able to resprout. I think bay laurel is probably the best example of a resprouting species out there. It puts out more growth after a fire than any other species that I can think of. This is just 4 years after the Whittier fire. This is along West Camino Cielo. This is my partner, Gabby. She is a average sized human, and I don't remember her height, but she's, this just makes her look really, really small. And again, this is only 4 years post fire. So these bay laurels do really, really well after fire. It's pretty amazing. And what we see in a lot of areas is a mixture of these different ecosystems, right? So like this is Figueroa Mountain. You'll get some montane hardwood conifer forest over in this area, and then it's a lot of chaparral. I don't have labels for some of these other things, but you definitely get some mixture. There's some coastal sage scrub here. A lot of this, it looks like, conifer forest, and it sort of is, but it's actually mostly big cone Douglas fir, which is pretty cool. And it's a unique type of forest. There's a lot of oak woodland down here. So you'll see these right next to each other. This whole area is included in the project, in the project area. And so we are always concerned about, there's a bunch of different ecosystems that might be treated sort of in this one way, this sort of blanket approach, and that can be quite problematic. But I think the biggest question is how what the Forest Service is proposing, like how does it actually affect wildfire? Like, is it, because one of their goals is to protect communities from wildfire, to limit the spread of these, large and intense wildfires on the landscape. So we have plenty of examples. There's also studies that have looked at this, but I'm going to show you some examples first here. So this is the Whittier fire. This is the Camino Cielo fuel break. So I showed a photo of this that I took from over here looking that way earlier in the presentation. And this is before the Whittier fire. So this is the Sherpa fire. You can actually see it had just occurred in 2016. This was a satellite image taken in 2017, right before the Whittier fire. And yeah, it's mostly mature chaparral. You can kind of just make out a little bit of the gap, the 2008 gap fire perimeter. You can still see it's a slightly different shade of green. It hasn't fully redeveloped into mature chaparral, but it's getting there. And then you can really see this fuel break just stretching across the entire ridgeline here. And this fuel break has been there since the 70s. And this is what happened. So the fire started over here. It was carried very quickly. It was spread up to the top of the ridge. Embers blew over the ridge. They blew down into these areas and then kind of burned their way back up toward the ridge. The fire didn't stop at the fuel break, and the Forest Service will often say fuel breaks aren't designed to stop fires, but they kind of are. They're not really designed to stop them on their own, but the point of them is to allow firefighters to get in there and do work so that they can suppress the fire. The problem is when you have fast moving fires and you have winds blowing embers sometimes miles ahead of the fire front, firefighters often aren't put in front of those oncoming flames. That can be really dangerous. And B, even if they are, embers can still move across the landscape and start spot fires. Then those develop into larger fires and combine and meet up with the main fire. What stopped this fire was a wind that was coming off the ocean, pushing it back up toward the ridge. So initially it was moving this way, and then it encountered this ridge line, came over, but then wind started pushing it back up this way. It was also encountering these interesting canyons. I mean, nobody's really looked at this, but I think there's something to this, which is there are some really some deep incised canyons that are east-west running in the San Ynez front country here, or in the Santa Barbara front country, which is pretty cool. But these are going to be areas where you have a much more higher moisture levels, and we'll often see fires naturally, stopping or slowing in these canyon areas where they're encountering shady, moist conditions, and they're often encountering riparian areas too. The gap fire stopped around the same area as well. You often see fires stopping at the same topographical features on the landscape, and there's physical reasons for that, but they haven't been explored so much. Another example, this is the Thomas fire. Before the Thomas fire, west of Ojai. So this is a fuel break system you can see just west of Lake Casitas. So there's the fuel break system here. Hopefully you can see that pretty easily. This is after the Thomas fire. It's hard to tell, but almost every single thing you see on this screen burned. The only area that didn't is over here by the lake. But the fire moved this way, blew right through these fuel breaks. I don't know if any firefighters were even put on these fuel breaks. But the point is, remote fuel breaks out in these backcountry locations, away from communities, away from homes, they tend to fail when it matters most, which is under those extreme weather conditions, right? And it's under those extreme weather conditions when we see the most acreage burned, and that's also when we see the most community damage occur. So the fires that happen in, like we hear, like we have a year-round fire season. That is only true in the sense that fires can start any time of year, especially under certain conditions. But for the most part, we have a pretty distinct fire season, and it is between June and November, December. And it really peaks in terms of the amount of acreage that burns, not necessarily the number of fires, but the amount of acreage in the Santa Ana wind season between September and November, December. But February, March, April, you're just not getting fires that are very large in those months. If they do occur, they're usually stopped pretty quickly, often less than like an acre or just a few acres. And they tend to not pose much of a risk to communities. It's these fires that we actually need to be concerned about. And if we're trying to protect communities from those fires, we have to do things that actually have been shown to be effective at protecting homes and people from these fires. I would say fuel breaks have not been shown to be effective under these extreme weather conditions. So if the point of these activities is to protect, in part to protect communities, And what is causing the most risk to communities is extreme weather driven fires. Uh, and fuel breaks aren't really doing much against those conditions, then we don't need to be investing into fuel breaks, especially considering all the ecological damage that can come along with those. There's a great paper from 2011 that really looked specifically at how fuel breaks affected fire spread across the landscape in Southern California in the national forest. There's actually two papers. One of them is focused specifically on the Los Padres, but they have this quote at the end that's basically like, constructing fuel breaks in remote backcountry locations will do little to save homes during a wildfire. Um, and that's been shown from a broader sense about fuel management in general. The farther you get away from homes, the less that is going to make a difference in terms of reducing that home's risk of exposure to wildfire. And that has everything to do with ember movement. You know, most homes that burn, they burn because embers are being blown into these homes. They get sucked into vents. They get sucked in through openings. Like if you leave a window open or if you have cracks under your door, those are all places where embers can get in. And so what we really have to do is address that issue. And going out here in the backcountry isn't really doing that. So I just wanted to real quick just show an area that I'm happy to talk more. And I was thinking maybe what we can do here in a moment is just take some questions, and if we want to look at the interactive map that we have online, we can look at some specific areas. But one of the areas that would be most heavily impacted in Santa Barbara County is the Figueroa Mountain area. So if you're familiar with this, a lot of these trails here you may know: Davy Brown Trail, Munch Canyon, White Rock, La Jolla over here. Those are almost entirely, most of these, I think all of these trails over here are entirely within the project area. So we could be looking at some major impacts to important recreation areas, not just considering the impacts to these ecosystems as well. So what happens from here? So I just love showing this because it looks crazy, but it's just to try to give you a sense of what the National Environmental Policy Act process looks like. And what we're at right now is that the Forest Service has issued a proposed action. They're in this, what we call the scoping phase. And so they've sent out a letter to interested parties. They've notified the public and they've said, hey, we want to do this project. And here's what we're proposing to do. It's kind of a brief description. And they have indicated that they only need to prepare an environmental assessment. The way NEPA works, the National Environmental Policy Act works, is that for any action that is being proposed on federal lands, you first have to ask, are significant impacts to the environment likely? If you're unsure, then you would do an environmental assessment. Theoretically, then that would tell you whether impacts are likely. If they are likely, then you would kind of go back to the beginning of this process and you would start creating what's called an environmental impact statement, which is a much more robust form of environmental review. If when you first ask this question, are significant impacts likely, and you can just know off the bat that there are going to be significant impacts, you would go straight to the environmental impact statement. So it is, in our view, absurd that the Forest Service is proposing a 235,000 acre project that involves a lot of intensive vegetation removal on a landscape using heavy equipment, ground disturbing equipment. And they're saying that they're unsure whether significant impacts are likely. One of the things that we're really focusing on in our own comment letter that we're sending to the Forest Service is that significant impacts are very likely. And that is why they need to just immediately start this process of creating an environmental impact statement. If they go this route, what will likely happen is that they would issue what's called a finding of no significant impact, which is called in the biz, it's called a FONSI, which is kind of fun. It's not really my favorite document to read, but it is it's got a real fun acronym, FONSI. And we see this all the time. And in fact, we see with most environmental review processes, they end up approving the project with maybe some minor mitigation measures or something. But a lot of times, they'll sort of push through what they want to do. And then that's why things end up in court often. Regardless, if they do an EA, an environmental assessment, or an environmental impact statement, what they will have to go through is this process called an objection process before they issue their decision. So when they release their final environmental impact statement, or they release the finding of no significant impact in the environmental assessment, people that have submitted comments in a timely manner throughout this process, they have standing to do something called an objection, and that is a non-court option to try to get the Forest Service to come to the table and maybe work out some differences and try to get some changes made before the final decision comes out. That can be a pretty, a useful process in some cases. But after that, they would release a decision. And then if, the public, if groups or individuals still have concerns about the project or think that it's violating environmental laws, they can then go to court. And just to give you a sense of like, when is an environmental impact statement needed over an environmental assessment? The Forest Service a few years ago, they approved a project up in the Monterey Ranger District that was a fuel break project. It was only 542 acres, and they did an environmental impact statement for that project. So now they're saying, well, we have this 235,000 acre project, which includes a lot of the same activities, but over a much bigger area, and it affects, many more ecosystem types. It affects a lot of designated critical habitat for endangered and threatened plants and wildlife. It affects a lot of inventoried roadless areas. And they're saying that they don't need to do an environmental impact statement. So that's where I come back to that word absurd, or mind-boggling is the other word I use a lot. So the way you can get involved as an individual, submit a comment for sure before the 27th of this month of September. That is the comment deadline. The Forest Service definitely needs to hear from you. You can go to lpfw.org/ERP. We've set up something really easy so that you can submit a comment straight to the Forest Service. And if you want to really explore some of these areas that would be impacted, check out our interactive map at lpfw.org/ERP-map. And again, I'm happy to go through that here after during our Q&A session if anyone's interested. And that's it. Let's move on to questions. You can check us out, check me out on social media. We post a lot of good educational information. Okay, so I'm going to move on to questions just to get a couple of things out of the way. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. My goal is to send it to people that attend and also to put it on our YouTube and our website. Let's look here. So I got one question that says, isn't the early 20th century when the Forest Service was suppressing fire, thereby artificially creating dense habitat? Not necessarily. So the sort of the classic tale is, 1910, we had this big, massive fire in Idaho, Montana. It was called the Big Burn. It was like 3 million acres burned in a couple of days. And the Forest Service said, no more. We're not doing this anymore. We're going to start putting out every fire at 10 a.m. by the next day after it gets ignited, right? And they started putting out every single fire on the landscape. What we really understand is that certainly became a policy, but true industrial fire suppression that was actually effective really didn't start until like the 40s, 50s. That's when you actually start seeing effective fire suppression in a lot of places. But in Southern California, especially in chaparral dominated areas, it has been shown through a bunch of different studies, which I didn't go through here, but I'm happy to pull any of these up if anyone's interested, that have shown that the last century or so of fire suppression hasn't really changed the occurrence of these big Santa Ana wind-driven fires, these wind-driven fires in chaparral. Whether small fires have been, effectively suppressed, over time, it doesn't matter so much when you have weather conditions that sort of override vegetation effects on the landscape. So chaparral, again, naturally very dense, has a lot of vegetation, can burn and can burn pretty fast and intensely. But the primary driving force of that is usually these wind conditions under which we've never been able to effectively suppress fires. And you just have to look at like the Thomas fire as an example. That was 2017. We're at like the height of modern fire suppression. We have all of these different tools available, and that fire started, in the evening, within a few hours, it was burning down parts of Ventura. It, was being driven by, I don't know, 50+ mile per hour winds. And there's nothing you can do on the landscape before that fire. And there's really not much you can do during the fire to change that outcome. And if you talk to firefighters that were on that fire down in Ventura, they were really just focused on trying to get people out of neighborhoods. They weren't even really out there like on the landscape trying to fight the fire necessarily. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm happy to expound upon that a little bit more. Another question I've got here is, are they justifying the fuel breaks as access points to fight fires as opposed to stopping fires? I mean, yeah, that's what usually they'll say these days is, well, it's not about stopping the fire. It's about providing access for firefighters to do suppression activities. Again, the problem is firefighters aren't being put in front of really fast moving fires. The fires that cause the most amount of acreage burned each year and the most damage to communities are exactly the fires that fuel breaks often aren't very effective, even as access points necessarily. Maybe you can do some stuff on the sides of the fire, on the flanks, but in terms of like where the wind is pushing the fire, fuel breaks in front of that, just they're not going to make much of a difference. And we've seen that over and over. The Thomas fire blew through 70+ miles of fuel breaks, the entire Ojai community defense zone fuel break network. We see this time and time again where under those extreme weather conditions, it doesn't really matter how much fuel breaks you have on the landscape. It doesn't even necessarily matter how many firefighters you have or how much suppression equipment you have. Planes aren't going to be, out there dropping retardant or water during high wind conditions or heavy smoke conditions. Firefighters aren't going to be placed in front of 60-mile-per-hour wind, driven fire runs. So again, if what people are concerned about are those big fires that make all the headlines, cause all the damage, and burn the vast majority of acreage each year, if that's what people are concerned about, agencies, individuals, groups, if that's the major concern, backcountry vegetation management isn't really the solution to address those fires. Those fires are going to occur whether we like it or not. And so we have to decide whether or not we throw money and resources at something that's not very effective in controlling them on the landscape, or we can put money into communities directly. We can do things like home hardening, defensible space, creating smoke and evacuation centers, fire shelters, community fire shelters, making sure evacuation and alert systems are adequate. Those are the things where we need to be really putting resources in. But the state government and the federal government are just dumping literally billions of dollars into vegetation management out in the backcountry for the most part. And we're going to see the same trends that we've been seeing over the last several years continue as climate change worsens. And I guess it will take many more homes burning and a lot, for policymakers to finally start shifting priorities. But I don't know when that will actually be. Is there an updated study about fuel breaks? That's a great question. And the answer is not really, actually. I was just reading a paper a couple nights ago about just talking about the sort of lack of like study into fuel breaks and their effectiveness. And basically most of the research has been done in Southern California and chaparral dominated areas. Those 2011 studies are still heavily cited. Those are the main studies. There was a big report issued by the Bureau of Land Management a couple of years ago about fuel breaks in the Great Basin and sagebrush habitat. Pretty mixed results, I would say. There have been some studies about what happens ecologically in fuel breaks, like how there have been studies about, what kind of fuel conditions are you creating? What are you doing in terms of invasive plant cover and spread? But yeah, in terms of their effectiveness, not so much. It's kind of weird, actually. I'm reading. Okay, so yeah, with everything I just said, then like, what is the true incentive behind the Forest Service carrying out this project and creating ineffective fuel breaks? They're getting massive amounts of money from Congress. I mean, Congress has been appropriating, people talk about the Forest Service not having, their budget has been shrinking and things like that. But what we're actually seeing is that Congress is each year they're pumping more money into these existing funding pipelines that are geared toward vegetation removal. We've been in so many meetings with the Forest Service where we hear every time that they're expecting a big windfall in terms of funding from the infrastructure bill that was passed. Was that last year? They just got another almost $2 billion for the Forest Service in the Inflation Reduction Act. There are all these different bills that are putting more money into this, and all these national forests are vying for the same pot of money. And so one of the reasons like the Forest Service here is wanting to do this project, and they're trying to do this environmental assessment as quickly as they can, just doing the one environmental assessment to cover this entire giant area, is because they want to show that that area, those 235,000 acres, are shovel ready, right? They've already had the environmental analysis. They're ready to receive funding and actually start doing the work. I don't know how else to put it. In some cases, there's a commercial incentive with logging, but in a lot of these like chaparral areas, I think it's just simply about trying to get more money to do more work. It sounds weird, but that's what's going on. Where can we find the forest statement for this project? Can that be found on your website? I think so. I can put it in the chat actually real quick. I got to find it first. LPNF. So if you just like Google LPNF projects, that will come up with like a project thing, a page that shows current and recent projects. The Ecological Restoration Project is at the very beginning. If you want to look at any documents from the Forest Service, there's not a lot, but they are right here. I'm putting them in the chat. There you go. So you can look. You would look at the scoping folder, and then they've got the project description. That's what you would probably want to look at. Someone asked, yeah, but isn't this after decades of being underfunded? Sure. That underfunding, though, I would say has been predominantly in the form of like recreation and other resource management rather than fire. The fire part of the Forest Service and other agencies has been doing much better than other aspects of the Forest Service. Even before some of these more recent bills that have been putting a lot more money toward the Forest Service for these types of projects were passed. I think it was like 76% of the local, like the Los Padres' budget was geared toward fire, suppression and prevention. Most of the personnel in national forest in the Western United States are fire personnel. I would say, yeah, there's been underfunding, but it's for like things like proper environmental review and trail management, maintenance, recreation site management, maintenance. I mean, there's a reason why, the Forest Service, like half of the recreation sites in the Los Padres National Forest are they're actually managed by a private company, and why most of the trail work that's done in the Los Padres is done by volunteer organizations. Yeah, I think that those are still big issues, and we would love to see more funding going to those aspects of what the Forest Service does. But throwing more money at backcountry vegetation projects and saying, this is going to help reduce, fire and fire-related disasters in communities. It's just, I have a colleague who says, like, sure, you're running faster, but if you're still running in the wrong direction, that's not going to get you where you need to go any sooner, right? And that's kind of how we view this. Okay, I've gotten through all the questions so far. So, we have an option here. I usually kind of put these at like an hour and a half, these webinars. I'm happy to go through if anyone's interested, who's still hanging around. If you want me to open up the interactive map, I can show you how to use it, and we can look at a couple of specific areas in Santa Barbara County or wherever anyone's interested. So, just let me know in the chat if you want to stick around and take a look at the interactive map, I'm happy to go through that. I'm also happy to keep answering questions. So got a yes, please. Oh, hi. I recognize your name. It's been a while. Yeah, let's take a look at the map. Sorry, I always like seeing familiar names in the chat. People like volunteers and stuff. This is great. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen again, but this time it's gonna be a little different. If I do this right. All right, everybody see can everybody see the map? I'm assuming yes. Great. Okay, so if you go to, again, lpfw.org/ERP-map, you can go along with me if you'd like. There it is. I actually don't know if that hyperlinked, but you can just put that in your URL bar. Obviously, the true link name is a little bit different. I try not to share this one because it's really long and annoying, but we have this redirect link that'll redirect you to this page. I just added trails to this morning, but there's a couple wonky things with it, so I'm still working on that. But the way this works is this is an interactive map, kind of like if you're on Google Maps or Apple Maps, something like that. You've probably dealt with these kind of maps before. So you can zoom in, zoom out, right? And there's a bunch of different layers. So you'll see all these if you go over here, and what you're seeing here is what you should be seeing at home. I'm in the mode where I don't have any like special privileges because I created the map. So I have several layers in here, some of which are just automatically turned off because you may not be interested in them. But like you may want to see the proposed Condor National Scenic Trail and how it might be impacted by the project. And like if we were to zoom in on some of these areas, you would see that the Condor Trail does in fact overlap with the project quite a bit. And when I calculated it, it was something like 48 miles of overlap. So you can toggle these by clicking this little eye. It's really easy. The red areas, those are part of the project area. And if you see red with kind of a darker outline around it, those are the forest health treatment units. So if you click on any one of these places, it'll tell you what type, project type it is. And then these other areas that are usually adjacent to those or out here, those are the fuel break and defense zones. So like here's the Santa Barbara front country. This is Santa Barbara. So you can see there's a lot of fuel break and defense zones. One of the weird things that I noticed right off the bat, which is strange for something called an ecological restoration project, is I see a bunch of straight lines, right angles, 90-degree angles. It's not really screaming like ecological anything to me. That looks more like arbitrary, human boundaries. And indeed it is. These are just weird little buffer zones along private public land boundaries. So you'll see like, yes, this is the national forest. This is the national forest boundary, but within the boundary, there are areas that are privately owned. We call those private inholdings. And so like the Forest Service doesn't actually own the land. We don't collectively own the land here. This is privately owned, but they do, all of this is national forest. So what they did was they drew these little buffer zones around private land boundaries, which is kind of frustrating just because like these are defense zones is what they're calling them. But I mean, if you look, it's not like these are right next to homes or something, right? I mean, like this is out here in this upper part of this canyon. It just, a lot of this doesn't make sense, and it certainly doesn't have anything to do with ecological restoration. There are certainly places that are closer to homes. There's some stuff over here by Painted Cave, a little bit closer, but a lot of backcountry project areas as well. One area that I think is really interesting is, so there was this project proposed back in, I don't remember what year it was, but this whole thing kind of played out in 2016. And it was this big fuel break that was going to stretch from Gaviota Peak all the way to Refugio Pass over here. And it was part of a larger fuel break project, most of which was centered around some communities up here in San Marcos Pass. And we were really concerned about this remote fuel break because it was going to cut through all these populations of this extremely rare manzanita called the Refugio manzanita. And we had some concerns about that and how they approved it. They approved it using a categorical exclusion, so they didn't actually do a really meaningful environmental review. So we ended up challenging that project in court, and the Forest Service agreed to drop that particular fuel break. And so we dropped our lawsuit once they did that. And they kept all, we didn't challenge these other fuel breaks that were right next to the communities. So anyway, we were surprised then, several years later to see that when this project was proposed, that fuel break is kind of back in the mix, right? So they're sort of proposing that same fuel break again as part of this project, which is really frustrating because, we thought we had agreed this fuel break was not really necessary, wasn't going to do much good in terms of community protection or fire mitigation, and it has a serious potential to impact a very restricted species, basically a manzanita species that only occurs at a certain elevation between Gaviota Peak and like San Ynez Peak. So very, very restricted. Let's see. I don't see any like questions or anything, so I'm just kind of floating around to different places. This is where am I? Yeah. Okay. So this is the Figueroa Mountain area, right? So like that is Figueroa Mountain right there. It's like the peak right there. If you've ever been to Figueroa Mountain Campground or Figueroa Campground, that's right here. It's that one with all the manzanitas. It's really pretty. This is Davy Brown Trail here. So I'm actually going to be leading a hike that is open to the public on Sunday, this coming Sunday. And we're going to hike from this trailhead here along Figueroa Mountain Road. And we'll hike. We're not going to hike this whole trail. We're just going to hike down into this area, kind of get into the heart of the project area here. This is all mostly big cone Douglas fir, really beautiful. One of my favorite places in the forest. And, I'll point out, native plants, and hopefully we'll see some wildlife, and we'll talk a little bit about the project. Someone asked if the project is about creating fuel breaks, then why are such large swaths of clearing planned? It's a great question. I mean, it's really overzealous, I would say. We're seeing some pretty massive swaths. Like, I don't mean to jump around too much, but like here's a really weird example. Just to put a finer point on this, like this is the San Ynez River, right? You can see the river flowing here, and look at this massive fuel break they have planned along the river. It's because there's a road here that isn't even open to the public anymore. It's been closed for several years after some storm damage. But this fuel break would extend, almost up the entire river. So this is in the San Ynez River riparian area. This is like, a lot of this is critical habitat for the California red-legged frog, very sensitive area. And it is just bizarre to see a fuel break proposed there. I'm not even sure what good a fuel break, could possibly do there in terms of fires, like, especially considering that, fires under those non-extreme weather conditions are likely going to encounter a natural fuel break in the form of the river and the riparian area itself because of moisture content. So yeah, this one's really bizarre. And it also includes, if we go back further over here, so like this is the Red Rock area I was talking about, right? So I'm sure some of you who are watching have been to this area. It's a really popular place to go swim. Like this whole area is included. So it's really strange. So yeah. Yeah. So what else? Yeah, they do keep proposing these fuel breaks in the backcountry over and over again, despite the evidence that they're not really working very well. Okay, so here's another area in Santa Barbara County that's kind of interesting. So this is the north-facing slope of the Sierra Madre Mountains. So this is the Sierra Madre Mountain, like the crest of the Sierra Madre Mountains. There's a road here that's closed during part of the year. This is Sierra Madre Ridge Road. But you can see there are these huge areas on the north-facing slope where it's mostly chaparral. There's probably some oaks, and there's maybe some like pinyon pines here and there. Maybe there's some coulter pines. I haven't spent a lot of time over here, but they've proposed this as a forest health treatment unit, and it's mostly shrubland. I'm still perplexed by this one. I don't quite understand what's going on. I think it has something to do. I should have mentioned this, but like the Forest Service they contracted out this environmental review process to a consulting firm out of Missoula, Montana. And what I'm thinking is going on here is that they just took a bunch of different GIS data. They probably haven't done like field validation of a lot of stuff. And if it met certain criteria, it was included in the project area. That's my guess. It's kind of hard to know exactly what they did. But you can see like they've proposed fuel breaks along trails, along smaller along roads that go up here. A lot of this is, I think it's definitely part of the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act. I just can't remember if it's potential wilderness or if it's new wilderness. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. The whole thing is this is the Tepiscay area, Tepiscay Canyon area. This is an interesting one. So like most of this is a what's called an inventory roadless area. So it's got some special protections through something called the inventory roadless the roadless area conservation rule 2001. And I've calculated that like 99% of this roadless area is included within the project. So that we just have never seen anything like that before. Usually these projects are proposed so that they try to avoid roadless areas if they can. Yeah, anyone have any specific places you want me to zoom in on? Oh, another cool thing that I've put together here. I guess I should have mentioned, like you can change the base maps. I think I might have done that without really explaining that. So this is the default base map, but you can change it so you can see the satellite imagery if you want, or the topo map. I mean, that can be kind of useful if you're used to looking at topo maps, but it's got a lot of text on the screen that can make things a little difficult to read from a distance. But I do have these bookmarks. These are pretty cool. So I've actually just highlighted specific places that I think are interesting or like they're important recreation areas, probably places that you may know of. So I've tried to include the indigenous names of some of these places where I can. And yeah, if you click on these, they will just automatically zoom to those areas. So it's not by county or anything. It is sort of like in order from east to west in the project area. So like this is the Lizard's Mouth area. So if you're familiar with Lizard's Mouth, Lizard's Mouth itself, they're not going to do anything there because it's so rocky, but all along the road there, certainly all along the north slope of the ridge here. Yeah, there's the Figueroa Mountain area. Someone asked about Big Sur, and yes, it does go all the way up to the Big Sur area. I'm going to be talking about this in the next webinar, so that'll be on this coming Thursday. Like here's where the majority of the project area in the Big Sur region is. I've got to fix this too. I just noticed this forest boundary is wrong. GIS work, it's never ending. Yeah, there's a lot of area actually in the southern portion of Big Sur. So you can see a big forest health treatment here around I think this is what, Pruitt Loop? Yeah, Pruitt Loop Trail. I don't know what trail this is, Mill Creek. So forest health treatment units there, bunch of fuel break in defense zones. Yeah, really pretty major impacts here. This is also like one of the only places on Earth. Actually, this area is the only place on Earth where you can find the Santa Lucia fir or the bristlecone fir. It's the rarest fir on the planet, true fir species. So that's a conifer tree, and that certainly could be impacted by the project, which is unfortunate. Okay, someone had another question regarding forest treatment reasoning. Has this been demonstrated to be one of any benefit to the environment, especially in chaparral? The Forest Service is claiming, like in the chaparral portions, they're saying they acknowledge that there's an issue with overly frequent fire. So they are acknowledging that chaparral is supposed to burn relatively infrequently, but that it is because of human-caused ignitions over the last several decades. A lot of areas are burning too frequently, and there's not enough time between fires for those seed banks to redevelop and things like that. Their justification for this project in those chaparral areas is that it will help limit fire spread across the landscape. And I think what they're trying to say is it will help prevent an area from burning too frequently because we'll be able to stop fires as they move across the landscape. But again, most of the acreage burned in any given year across the landscape is under those more extreme weather conditions where the fuel breaks aren't going to be very effective. So it's unlikely to change fire frequency in a positive way very well. And by that I mean it probably isn't going to reduce fire frequency in a lot of these chaparral areas. And there's actually there's I think good reason to believe that it could go the opposite direction, because a lot of these fuel breaks being proposed are along roads and trails, especially roads and like motorized trails, OHV, off-road vehicle trails. These are the places where we see human activity is concentrated, and that's where we see most ignitions occur. They tend to occur, and there are plenty of studies on this, in close proximity to a road. So when you take a roadside area, and you start converting that into these non-native grassy, weedy areas that are really flammable during most of the year, and we know that human-caused ignitions occur close to roads, you're asking for increased ignitions, basically. I call this like expanding ignition zones. So we're really concerned about that aspect of the project. Whether how it affects forest ecosystems, that some of what they're proposing is in certain forest types is debated in the scientific literature. There's still a lot of debate about that. But like in other types, ecosystem types, like pinyon juniper, which is mostly, where am I? It's like up in this region. So this is mostly pinyon juniper. Like if I were to zoom in here, you might think this is conifer forest, and it may show up as conifer, forest in some databases. But this is pinyon juniper. These are single leaf pinyon pines. That's the dominant tree here. These are in a very dry, very arid area that has low fire frequency, and when it does burn, it tends to burn pretty intensely, and then that starts a very long process of succession that eventually leads back to pinyon juniper woodland. But the natural fire frequency in these areas, and according to some studies, is likely even longer than in like a lot of the chaparral dominated areas, just because you have so little fire activity, so little natural lightning occurrence, but also just you don't have a lot of continuity in terms of vegetation between areas, and so there's a lot of open kind of bare areas on the in the understory. But in other cases, though, it can be really dense. Like if you look up on, like this is in the Takuya Ridge area, you can see really dense pinyon juniper woodland up here. And that's where you would expect pretty intense fire naturally. And there's some good studies that have looked at historical pinyon juniper conditions. And the conclusion has been in Southern California that there hasn't really been much change to pinyon junipers during the fire suppression period. Okay, so yeah, that's the map. Definitely play around with it. Go take a look at it. I'm still gonna make some updates. There are a couple little things some folks have pointed out to me, like this is not actually a wilderness edition in the Central Coast Heritage Protection Act, but it's rather a proposed potential wilderness. Just stuff like that. There's some minor things. I've got to fix some of these trails. There's like duplicate trail lines. I've got to fix some of that, but for the most part, it's pretty accurate, and it should be useful to you. Okay, well, we've kind of dwindled in terms of people who are still around. I appreciate everyone sticking around and asking so many great questions. And let me know if you have any follow-up questions. You can email me, bryant@lpfw.org. Yeah, I again encourage you to go and submit a comment, lpfw.org/ERP. And if you're with an organization that might be interested in signing on to like a group letter, expressing concerns about the project, let me know, because we will have a group sign-on letter here pretty soon. So thank you again. I'm going to stop the webinar recording. First, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to stop. Thank you for everyone watching at a later date. You should have information somewhere below or above here if you're on our website or on our YouTube channel, that can kind of point you in the right direction.